My name is Cornelia Witthöft and I'm professor in food science at LNU. My research is on the quality of food, and we develop new healthy foods, and we are interested in food and health associations. For that reason, we extract and analyze nutrients and bioactive compounds in, for instance, food or clinical material. And here you see where we extract the clinical samples. And here we have some equipment which we often use for extraction of food samples and raw material. For analysis of bioactive compounds and nutrients, for instance, folate or polyphenols, we use either the HPLC or the LC-MS. Here in the food science teaching lab, we have, for instance, the mill or incubators or freezers, fridges, cooking equipment, which is used for producing food to be consumed. And here we also have the possibility to carry out sensory trials.
Good morning. I hope everybody hears me, and I hope everybody can see my screen. In my talk, I want to give, after a short introduction, information about nutrients and bioactive compounds affecting health, which are in pulses, other food quality characteristics of pulses, and give some few examples on research. Our dietary habits are monitored using a survey technique, Riksmaten, regularly by the Swedish National Food Administration. And it shows that we in our diet have too little fruit, vegetables and fish, or that we also lack enough intake of some nutrients like fiber, iron, D vitamin and folate. And in contrast, we eat too much saturated fat and, for instance, added sugar. If we look into the intake of vegetables, we see that in contrast to the 500 gram as recommended per day, the intake is about 170, 180 gram per day, and the legumes are only 7%, which would come up to 12 gram per day, so very low. When I talk about pulses in my talk, I mean the dried mature legume grains, and I'm now mainly focusing on these grains. I'm not so much focusing on vegetable legumes and not at all on livestock forage or oilseeds. Legumes and pulses are linked to several health benefits, and this is due to their content of bioactive compounds and nutrients. Fiber, polyphenols, which also lead to a low GI, are positively linked to glycemic control, which is of benefit with respect to type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome. The content of potassium and magnesium is linked to minimized risk for hypertension. We have positive effect of cardiovascular diseases, and for this strong scientific evidence is available. However, it's also promising evidence, but still inconsistent or insufficient data with respect to positive benefits from with respect to cancer, weight management and gut health. The pulses contain many nutrients, which are the nutrients or risk nutrients, which we just discussed with respect to the Swedish diet. And here you see a comparison of cooked meat or a cooked portion of different domestic legume grains. And please consider that the serving size is different, which is following the recommendations of the Swedish National Food Administration. The energy content of these is quite similar, and with the protein content, the pulses are almost catching up in comparison to meat products. But we have a much more positive situation with respect to a low fat content and also very healthy fatty acids, a high content of dietary fiber, which is one of the risk nutrients in our diet, and also a very high content of folate, another vitamin of which we have a deficiency of. But the pulses are also discussed with respect to some anti-nutritional compounds. And these compounds interfere, for instance, like lectins and phytate with the absorption and digestion of both macro and micronutrients in our food. And also other compounds like glycosides can, for instance, lead to flatulence. However, recent research has shown that small amounts of these compounds can even have a positive effect, for instance, with a postprandial improved blood glucose response or also with improved blood cholesterol levels. Because pulses are a traditional food, there's no tolerable daily intake or accurate reference dose defined, but we know that after cooking, the content of these compounds is reduced so that we can expect positive effects. So the food processing has an impact on how much of these anti-nutritive compounds or potential positive compounds or bioactive compounds are left in the pulse food. And the best reduction we have after hydrothermal processing. So that is cooking, and it is recommended to have a long soaking period of 12 to 14 hours. This leads to increased digestibility of starch and proteins and the highest decrease of anti-nutritional compounds, abbreviated ANF in this slide. One processing method I can also already mention, which leads to only a medium decrease of anti-nutritional compounds, but an improved digestibility of other macronutrients and micronutrients, and even a de novo synthesis of vitamins, is germination. So we know that the pulses have a positive health effect and have a potential. So it is important to test their suitability as functional ingredients. And we have produced some pulse flours from domestic pulses, yellow and gray pea and faba bean and white bean, and have prepared these pulse flours with different preparation methods by soaking and boiling, germination, or roasting. These pulse flours we have then compared to ordinary wheat flour, and we have both characterized nutrients and also the functional properties. With respect to nutrients, we've seen that the pulse flours have an increased content of folate, which is especially high after germination. We have also an increased content of raw starch, however, the highest of resistant starch. However, the highest amount of resistant starch is in the raw white bean. And also the content of total dietary fiber is high, and the beans have usually a higher content than peas. And you see that the nutrients are several-fold higher in comparison to normal wheat flour. If we look at the functional properties of these pulse flowers, we've seen that they all have a high water absorption capacity. That makes them very suitable for producing sausages, custards, and butter. However, their emulsion and foaming properties are not as high, which makes them not so suitable for cakes and mayonnaise. And as sole thickening or gelling agents, they are not suitable. We also looked at the volatile compounds in these pulse flowers, as the beanie taste is something which not all consumers appreciate. And we have here data from domestic yellow and grey pea, and you see data with regard to raw and boiled products, or flowers made from raw and boiled peas and yellow and grey peas. We have identified 43 volatile compounds and also several specific markers for the beanie flower. And after boiling, we have seen that the amount of alcohols decreased and the amount of aldehydes increased, which you can see by the blue and other colors. And you see that the aldehydes are the compounds which we have in the most amount in our flowers. Boiling leads to a markant decrease of markers for beanie flower. So we've seen they are promising raw material, and they have another food quality or attribute, and that is, of course, the environmental sustainability. We have in a study assumed a scenario where we have, based on the data of the national survey Riksmaten, calculated the effects of reducing intake of meat by 50% and replacing this with the same amount of cooked domestic pulses. What we saw was that we have a climate impact reduced by 20%, and that we have also less requirement of land by 23%. But one could wonder how this affects the intake of nutrients, and this is what you see on this slide. We compared for our scenario diet the effect on nutrient intake as compared to the recommendations of the National Food Administration. And you see in the black boxes or the black line, which corresponds to the recommended amounts of the nutrients. And you see with the staples, first the current Swedish diet, and always the second staple, the scenario diet. And we see in green the effects from the grain legumes or pulses, and in red the effect from meat, and gray are the other foods. And you can see an improvement of the intake of fiber and also of folate thanks to the pulses. And this is data for the average population. However, one has to keep in mind for specific population groups like young women in childbearing age, the current diet and the future diet or scenario diet would not be sufficient regarding intake of folate and iron. So pulses are promising novel foods, and we have, by a very simple change of processing technique, developed two promising new foods which are richer in nutrient content. We've seen that germination can increase folate content, the vitamin folate, by de novo synthesis 1 to 3-fold. And by just introducing a germination step into a normal process, or by incorporating germinated pulse flour into the producing of cookies, we have managed to produce a bean conserve, which is 50% higher in folate than the traditional food, and cookies which are up to 6 times higher in their folate content than traditional cookies. And in a last trial, and this is now my last slide, we have tested these foods and their impact on folate status or folate on health. We have given in an intervention study these new foods to women in childbearing age and have compared the effects to a group of women who received twice the dose of supplemental folic acid and compared this to a control group not receiving any folate. And you see to the right the effects on the plasma folate and erythrocyte folate, which are the status parameters. And you can see that compared to start of the study, in both groups, the supplemental folic acid group and the food group, the status parameters have improved significantly. So this proves that pulse foods both can have a positive effect on the vitamin folate status, as well as they have other beneficial health effects. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer to questions.
Thank you very much, Cornelia, for an interesting talk. So now I invite you for questions. If you have any questions for Cornelia, so please. Åsa, yes, I can see your hand.
Thank you, Cornelia, for a nice presentation. You can hear me?
Yes.
Yes, good. So I was curious about these, you call them volatile compounds. Is this known that, so these, the ones that you showed, are these the ones that sometimes is called the beanie taste compounds? Is it well known, these compounds?
Yeah and no. There are some studies, not too many, and we have looked at the whole pattern. What you saw in my staples is the whole pattern. And of these compounds, 3 to 5 compounds are defined as the beanie flavor compounds. I have listed them on my slide, and we have also the publication where I have shown the link to, which is open access. So they are specific compounds which have been identified by other groups in other pulses, and we have now found them also in the Swedish pulses.
Okay, thanks.
Any more questions for Cornelia? I have a question about soybean compared to other beans, because we have heard that and read that soybean is the best bean on earth, and it's a really nice content of proteins and good quality. So is there a good alternative to soybeans or going to combine different kinds of beans to be able to reach the soybean?
I know what you want to come to. Yes, it is true that the soybean protein has a high bioavailability or availability or digestibility and a very high quality. And in that respect, it is superior to other the domestic pulses or other pulses. But we do not really have problems with protein intake and consumption in the Swedish diet. That is visible by Riksmaten. And if you nicely and smartly combine pulses with cereal food, you improve the quality of protein. So you get a more favorable amino acid composition. So an improvement would be by simply mixing cereal food and pulse food. And you can either do that by having a meal, including both types of protein, or by developing a food which contains both.
Thank you. Okay.
There is a question in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, can you please read it, Gun? Chat, because the question.
I don't know if Cornelia can see it. I just saw
Yeah, what was the effect of germination of the pulses you studied on the sensory product of properties of the product? Yes, that is a good question. And I have to admit that some germination might lead to not always a good taste. And the chickpea germination actually led to a reasonably bad taste. So roasting is the processing technique which gives a very nice taste, and especially the roasted grey peas were fantastic, while the germinated flowers were not all by taste well. But then again, you cannot taste flowers very easily. You would need to produce a food and test them then as ingredient in the food, and you would not be able to use these flowers because they don't have the perfect baking properties as a whole or sole ingredient. You always have to mix them then to get the gluten structure with some wheat flour.
Okay, thanks.